The carriage rattled along the winding road, cutting through mist and autumn rain, until at last the great silhouette of Ravenshire Hall emerged through the fog. The estate stood vast and solemn on the moors of Yorkshire, all grey stone, high towers, and shuttered windows that reflected no light. The locals called it the house that forgot how to laugh. Inside the carriage sat Eliza Hartwell, a young woman of 26, her hands clasped tightly around a small leather valise that contained everything she owned: a few worn books, a letter of recommendation, and her late mother's locket. The rest of her life had been swallowed by debt and duty. When her father's business failed and she lost her home in London, this post, as governess to the Duke of Ravenshire's children, was her one chance to begin again. The coach came to a halt before the iron gates. The driver leaned down, his hat dripping with rain. "We're here, miss," he said softly, glancing up at the enormous house with the same uneasy respect one might give a cathedral. Eliza stepped out, the chill immediately sinking through her cloak. The gates opened with a groan, and as she walked up the gravel path, the crows that perched on the battlements took flight, their cries echoing in the damp air. She had heard whispers of Lord Sebastian Ravenshire, widowed 3 years past, reclusive, cold, and haunted by the loss of his wife. They said his temper was sharp, his heart harder still, and that even his children dared not raise their voices in his presence. Yet Eliza refused to be frightened by stories. She had survived hunger, grief, and London's indifference. What was one more storm to weather? At the door she was met by Mrs. Pembroke, the housekeeper, a woman of kind face but weary eyes. "Miss Hartwell," she said, curtsying lightly, "His Grace is expecting you. The children are in the schoolroom. Come this way, if you please." Eliza followed her through a corridor lined with portraits, proud men in military coats, women draped in silk and pearls, all painted with expressions of expectation and judgment. The house smelled faintly of dust and rain. Every footstep echoed. When they reached the study, Mrs. Pembroke knocked once before opening the heavy oak door. Inside, the fire burned low. Behind the desk sat a tall man in black, his posture straight, his presence commanding, even in silence. "Your Grace," Mrs. Pembroke said softly. "Miss Eliza Hartwell." The Duke looked up. His eyes, gray as the morning sky, studied her with calm precision. He was younger than she expected, perhaps in his mid-30s, but his face bore the strain of years lived under sorrow. A faint scar traced his jawline. His hands, though elegant, were restless, as if unused to stillness. "Miss Hartwell," he said, his voice measured and low. "You've come from London?" "Yes, Your Grace." "You've references?" She handed him the letter. He scanned it briefly, then set it aside. "Mrs. Pembroke informs me you've taught before." "I have, Your Grace, at a small school in Chelsea, until its closure." "I see." He leaned back slightly. "My children require discipline and routine. You will find them spirited." "I shall do my best to guide them," she said calmly. His gaze flicked up to her again, colder this time. "Affection is not required. Education is." Her pulse quickened, but she nodded. "Understood, Your Grace. Mrs. Pembroke will show you to your room. You'll begin lessons tomorrow." As she curtsied to leave, she thought she caught the faintest hesitation in his tone. Not cruelty, but weariness, like a man who had forgotten how to speak gently. When she reached her chambers, a modest room overlooking the gardens, she set down her valise and breathed out slowly. Beyond the window, the mist rolled across the moors like a living thing. Somewhere below, a child's laugh echoed, sudden, brief, and quickly hushed. Eliza smiled faintly. "So," she whispered to the empty room, "there is still laughter here." That night, she unpacked her books, lit a single candle, and whispered a promise into the quiet. "If this house has forgotten love, then perhaps I can help it remember." She did not know that, at that very hour, in a study below, the Duke of Ravenshire sat alone by the fire, turning the locket his late wife once wore between his fingers, and wondering for the first time in years why the sound of a stranger's voice had stayed with him long after she had gone. The next morning broke pale and still. Mist clung to the moors like breath on glass, and the chimneys of Ravenshire Hall released thin curls of smoke into the gray sky. Inside the manor, the servants moved quietly, as though the walls themselves demanded silence. Eliza Hartwell dressed simply, fastening the last button of her modest gray gown before pinning her hair neatly at her nape. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the strange weight of beginning again. She paused before the mirror, catching her reflection in the soft light, and whispered, "You've faced worse than this?" Then, gathering her courage, she stepped into the corridor. The housekeeper, Mrs. Pembroke, guided her to the schoolroom at the end of a long oak-paneled hallway. The walls were lined with books that hadn't been touched in years. The faint scent of ink, paper, and chalk lingered like memory. Inside, 2 children sat at a large table, a boy of 8 and a girl of 6. They looked up as Eliza entered, their faces pale and uncertain. "This is Miss Hartwell," Mrs. Pembroke announced gently, "your new governess." The boy bowed his head with solemn precision. "Good morning, Miss Hartwell." The girl only stared, clutching a worn doll in her hands. "Good morning," Eliza said softly, kneeling slightly so her eyes met theirs. "And what might your names be?" The boy replied, "Thomas." Then, motioning to the girl, "And this is Clara." "Thomas and Clara," she repeated with a smile. "2 fine names indeed. I'm sure we'll be very good friends." Clara blinked. "Do you like dolls?" Eliza smiled. "Very much, especially when they behave during lessons." The child giggled, the sound quick and bright, as though surprised to have escaped her own lips. Thomas looked at his sister with equal surprise. It was, Eliza realized, the first laughter she'd heard since entering the house. When Mrs. Pembroke departed, Eliza began her lessons gently, blending instruction with kindness. She taught arithmetic through stories, geography through painted maps, and history through the voices of heroes long past. The children leaned in, wide-eyed, as she spoke of brave queens and great explorers. Hours passed unnoticed. For the first time, the schoolroom felt alive. But not everyone welcomed the change. When the door opened that afternoon, Eliza turned, and the warmth in her voice faltered. The Duke stood in the doorway, his tall frame shadowing the light. His expression was unreadable, his gray eyes colder than the mist outside. "Your Grace," she murmured, curtsying. Thomas and Clara immediately fell silent, their posture stiff with fear. "I see my children are engaged," he said slowly, stepping inside. "Yes, Your Grace," Eliza replied carefully. "They're excellent pupils." His gaze moved over the chalkboard, the scattered papers, the small painted globe. "I was under the impression their lessons would begin at 9. "They did, Your Grace. We simply lost track of time." His eyes lifted to hers, sharp, assessing. A governess who loses track of time. Interesting. Eliza felt her heart tighten, but she held his gaze. It seems, Your Grace, that learning is best remembered when one enjoys it. He studied her for a long moment, as though deciding whether her words were defiance or truth. Then, finally, he said, "Do not mistake this household for a nursery of indulgence. The children require structure, not amusement." "I understand," she said softly, "but perhaps both are possible." The silence that followed was heavy, but not hostile, more like two worlds measuring each other's edges. Finally, he turned to leave. "Mrs. Pembroke will see that you have everything you need. You may dine with the staff. My children's supper is at 6. "Yes, Your Grace." At the door, he paused briefly, his back still to her. "Clara has not laughed in 3 years," he said quietly. "I would prefer she not be made to cry again." Before she could respond, he was gone. Eliza stood still for a long time, her pulse thudding softly in her throat. She looked toward the children, who sat rigidly at their desks, uncertain. Slowly, she smiled. "Well," she said gently, "I think we shall make him smile before this year is out." "What do you think?" Thomas's eyes widened. "Father doesn't smile." "Then," she said with quiet certainty, "we shall teach him." The boy frowned. "You can't teach grown-ups." "Oh, I believe you can," Eliza said, turning toward the window where the fog was beginning to lift. "You simply have to remind them what it feels like to be a child." And though she did not know it, the Duke paused in the corridor outside, listening to the sound of his children's laughter echoing once more through the halls, a sound that both soothed and unsettled him, because it belonged to a world he had long buried with his grief. The next weeks passed in a rhythm that was both gentle and transforming. The once silent halls of Ravenshire Hall began to echo with sounds long forgotten. The light patter of children's footsteps, the rustle of papers, the delicate hum of laughter hidden behind lessons. Eliza Hartwell proved to be unlike any governess the household had ever seen. She did not merely instruct, she inspired. Arithmetic became a game of pebbles and riddles. Grammar, a play of words and rhymes. She taught geography through painted maps she drew herself, and history through whispered reenactments that made the children gasp and giggle. The servants noticed first. "There's life in the East Wing again," whispered one maid. "Miss Hartwell's doing, no doubt." Even Mrs. Pembroke, long used to the cold shadow that had fallen over the manor, smiled more freely. "The Duke won't admit it," she murmured one morning while polishing the silver, "but the house feels warmer when she's near." For his part, Lord Sebastian Ravenshire tried to ignore the change. He buried himself in his study, working late into the night, his quill scratching furiously across papers he scarcely read. But the sound of distant laughter, his children's laughter, found its way through even the thickest doors. It disquieted him. It tempted him. One afternoon, he passed the open door of the schoolroom. He meant to walk by, but something stopped him. Through the half-open doorway, he saw Eliza sitting cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by books and scattered colored stones. Thomas was arranging them into patterns, while little Clara watched with wide eyes. "Now," Eliza said softly, "if the red stones are soldiers and the white ones are messengers, what happens if they march together toward the king's castle?" "They win!" Thomas cried, throwing up his arms in triumph. Eliza laughed, light and musical, the sound wrapping around him like sunlight through a window. Clara giggled too, clutching her doll. For a moment, Sebastian felt something ache deep within him, a memory of laughter that used to fill these same walls before death took it from him. He stepped inside. Instantly, the room went still. The children straightened. Eliza rose to her feet, smoothing her skirts, her smile fading into polite composure. "Your Grace," she said softly. He nodded once. "Lessons seem spirited." Eliza's voice remained calm. Children learn best when joy accompanies discipline. He looked at her for a long moment, the steady confidence in her tone, the kindness in her gaze. Then he turned to his children. "Are you behaving?" "Yes, Father," Thomas said quickly, his voice small. "And you, Clara?" Clara hesitated, then whispered, "Miss Hartwell says I read very well today." "She did indeed," Eliza added gently. "She recited an entire verse from the Pilgrim's Song without stumbling once." Sebastian's expression softened almost imperceptibly. He approached the small desk where his daughter's book lay open. The handwriting was neat, the pages carefully turned. "Well done," he said quietly. "Your mother loved that poem." Clara blinked, surprised. She had never heard him speak of her mother before. He looked up then, meeting Eliza's gaze. For a heartbeat, the air between them held something unspoken. Gratitude, perhaps, or the first flicker of something more dangerous. When he left the room, he found himself pausing at the door again. Behind him, Eliza resumed the lesson, her voice bright and patient. "You see," she said to the children, "even the Duke can smile if given good reason." Thomas gasped. "He smiled?" "Nearly," she whispered conspiratorially. Both children burst into laughter. Outside, in the corridor, Sebastian stopped walking. His hand brushed against his chest as though his heart had startled at a forgotten sensation. Then, before he could stop himself, he smiled, faintly, awkwardly, but undeniably. That night, as he sat alone in his study, he found himself listening for the sound of her voice. When it came, faintly, from down the hall, he closed his eyes and let it wash over him. She was reading aloud again, her words lilting and rhythmic, soothing the children to sleep. He could almost see her sitting by the fire, the two little heads resting on her lap, the soft glow of candlelight on her face. Without realizing it, his hand had stilled over his papers. For the first time in years, the loneliness in the house no longer felt invincible. He leaned back in his chair and whispered into the empty room, "You've brought laughter back, Miss Hartwell, and with it something I'd thought long buried." Winter crept upon Ravenshire Hall like a slow tide, turning the moors to silver beneath frost, and the windows to mirrors of ice. The world outside grew silent, but within the house something new had begun to stir. The laughter that had returned to its corridors no longer seemed foreign. It began to belong. Each morning Eliza Hartwell rose before dawn. She would walk through the east gardens, now white with snow, her breath clouding in the air. Sometimes she sang softly as she walked, old songs from her childhood, tunes that carried warmth into the coldest corners of her heart. And though she never noticed it, a shadow sometimes watched from the upper windows. The Duke himself, drawn once more by that sound he could not banish from memory. The Duke had changed in small ways, almost imperceptibly. He no longer barked orders at the servants. He no longer ate alone in silence. Once, When Mrs. Pembroke had timidly suggested a Christmas tree for the children, he had almost refused. But then he had seen Eliza at the far end of the hall, her hands busy stringing dried oranges and ribbons with Clara, her laughter bright as bells. "Do as you wish," he'd murmured, turning away before anyone could see the smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. From that day, the hall began to transform. The fire burned longer. Music, forbidden since his wife's death, returned, quietly at first, then fully, with Clara's soft humming and Eliza's lilting voice. But it wasn't only the house that was changing. It was Sebastian Ravenshire himself. He began finding reasons to pass through the schoolroom, to inquire about the children's progress, or to leave books by accident. Sometimes he lingered by the door, watching Eliza as she bent over Clara's reading or laughed at Thomas's mischief. There was grace in every movement, a gentle strength that stirred something deep within him, something he had locked away behind grief and guilt. One evening, when the snow fell thick and silent, the children begged to decorate the great hall. Eliza agreed on the condition that they invite their father to join. "The Duke?" Thomas asked, eyes wide. "He won't." "Then we must give him a reason to," Eliza replied with a smile. So that night, as candles flickered and pine filled the air, the hall glowed with life. The servants gathered quietly, watching the children hang ornaments and garlands. Then, to everyone's astonishment, the Duke himself appeared at the top of the stairs. He hesitated, a man out of place in his own home, until Eliza stepped forward, her eyes meeting his. "Your Grace," she said softly, "would you care to hang the star?" The hall fell silent. He looked at her, at the quiet invitation in her voice, the trust in her gaze, and something inside him relented. Taking the golden star from her hands, he walked to the tree and placed it at the top. The children clapped. Clara ran to hug his leg, and for once he didn't flinch. When Eliza thanked him, her hand brushed his glove, a fleeting touch, almost nothing, but he felt it like warmth against frost. Later that evening, when the candles burned low and the others had gone to bed, Sebastian lingered by the fire. He found Eliza there, gathering ribbons from the floor. "You've changed this house," he said quietly. She looked up, surprised. "I've only done my duty, Your Grace." He shook his head. "Duty does not bring laughter, nor peace." Their eyes met in the glow of the firelight. For a moment, neither spoke. The storm outside beat against the windows, the snow falling heavier by the minute. Then, unexpectedly, he said, "I used to believe joy was dangerous, that it could be taken as easily as it was given." "And now?" she asked gently. "Now," he murmured, his gaze softening, "I wonder if perhaps I was only afraid of it." Eliza smiled faintly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Fear fades, Your Grace, when one remembers what warmth feels like." He held her gaze for one heartbeat too long before turning away. "Good night, Miss Hartwell." "Good night, Your Grace." When she left the hall, her pulse trembled with something she dared not name. And when he stood alone before the dying fire, Sebastian touched the golden star she had handed him earlier, the star that had once belonged to his late wife, and whispered, "Forgive me, Celeste, for remembering how to feel." Outside, the snow fell in quiet absolution, as if the heavens themselves blessed the fragile beginning of something neither could yet understand. The following days brought a calm that felt almost impossible within the old stone walls of Ravenshire Hall. Snow still blanketed the moors, yet the house, for the first time in years, seemed to hum with quiet life. There was laughter, there were footsteps, and most astonishing of all, there was music. It began one gray morning when Eliza entered the drawing room to find an old piano draped beneath a dust cloth. She paused, her fingertips brushing against its covered keys. The wood was smooth, though faintly scarred by time. Something about it seemed to ache with silence. Mrs. Pembroke entered behind her. "That piano hasn't been played since her Grace's death," the housekeeper said softly. "His Grace forbade it." Eliza nodded. "Did she play often?" "Every evening. The house used to breathe through music." Mrs. Pembroke hesitated, then added, "He can't bear the sound now." Eliza understood. Grief could make a tomb of the most beautiful things. And yet, as she looked at the dust-draped instrument, she felt that perhaps silence had ruled long enough. That night, after the household had gone still, Eliza returned to the drawing room. The fire had burned low, casting gold and shadow across the walls. Slowly, she lifted the cloth from the piano. Dust rose into the air like memory. Her hands trembled slightly as she pressed the first key. A single note filled the silence, a ghost of sound that seemed to awaken the very air. Another note followed, then another, forming the tune of a lullaby her mother once sang. Soft, tender, fragile. She played not to defy, but to heal. But she did not know that upstairs the Duke had been unable to sleep. He had been pacing the length of his study, restless when he heard it, the faint melody rising through the walls. His blood turned to ice. For a moment he stood frozen, caught between anger and disbelief. Then, with sudden resolve, he strode down the corridor, his footsteps echoing through the dark. He pushed open the drawing-room doors. Eliza gasped and rose from the piano bench, her hands still hovering above the keys. "Your Grace, He stood in the doorway, his face half shadowed by the firelight, his expression unreadable. "I thought I made it clear that music is forbidden in this house." Her heart thudded. "Forgive me. I did not mean disrespect. It was only—" She hesitated, her voice softening. It was too silent. His eyes flashed. "Silence is peace, Miss Hartwell." "Is it?" she asked quietly. "Or is it punishment?" The words hung between them like struck glass. He stared at her, anger giving way to something rawer, something closer to pain. "You don't understand," he said finally. "That piano was hers." "I know," she whispered. "That's why I played, to remind this house that love once lived here and still could." He turned away sharply, running a hand through his hair. "You presume too much." "Perhaps," she admitted. "But grief cannot live forever, Your Grace. It must be spoken to, or it consumes everything around it." For a long moment, the only sound was the crackle of the fire. Then, to her surprise, he crossed the room and placed his hand gently upon the piano. His fingers lingered on the keys, trembling slightly. "She used to play a song," he murmured. "A simple one, the last thing I ever heard before the carriage crash, the memory of rain, the scream." Eliza said nothing. She simply waited, her presence quiet, patient, like the promise of dawn. Finally, he pressed one key. A single note rang out, then another. His hand faltered halfway through the melody, his breath catching. "I can't," he whispered, pulling back. Eliza stood, stepping beside him. "Then let me." Together, their hands hovered above the keys. Slowly, she began to play. He watched, his jaw tight, his heart unsteady. When the final chord faded, silence fell again. But this time it was not cruel. It was peace. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft. "You should not have done that." "Perhaps not," she replied, her gaze steady, "but I think you needed to hear it." He met her eyes then, and for the first time since his wife's death, he did not look away. Something unspoken passed between them, something fragile but real. When she left the room, the Duke remained by the piano. He touched the keys once more, feeling the echo of her warmth beneath his fingertips, and when he finally returned to his chamber, he found himself whispering into the dark, not in anger, but wonder. Her song, how does she make the silence hurt less? Outside, the wind moved softly through the trees, carrying the faintest echo of music with it, like a promise the house dared to believe again. For days after the music, Ravenshire Hall seemed changed. The air felt lighter, even the servants moved with unspoken relief, as if some shadow had been lifted from their shoulders. The piano, once a relic of pain, now stood uncovered in the drawing-room, its surface polished, its presence no longer mourned, but quietly honored. Yet, to Eliza Hartwell, it was not peace she felt, but uncertainty. She feared she had overstepped, that the Duke's silence since that night meant anger. Still, she would not regret what she had done. Healing, she knew, rarely came without courage. It was 3 evenings later when the summons came. "His Grace requests your presence in the library," Mrs. Pembroke said softly, her eyes betraying both curiosity and concern. Eliza's heart quickened. She smoothed her gown, squared her shoulders, and followed the housekeeper down the long corridor lit by flickering sconces. The heavy oak door stood slightly ajar. Candlelight spilled from within. She knocked gently. "Enter." The Duke's voice was low, measured, but there was no anger in it, only weariness. She stepped inside. The room was vast and lined with books that reached the ceiling. A fire glowed in the hearth, and Sebastian Ravenshire stood before it, his back to her, his hand resting on the mantelpiece. "Your Grace," she began carefully, "you wish to see me?" He turned then, and she saw in his eyes not fury, but a quiet torment that seemed older than the house itself. "I did," he said slowly. "Please, sit." She obeyed, taking the chair opposite his desk. For a long moment he said nothing, his gaze lost in the fire. Then, with a breath that sounded almost like surrender, he began to speak. "When you played that night," he said, "I thought I would go mad. The sound, it tore through me like a blade. I nearly shouted for you to stop, and yet I could not." Eliza's voice was gentle. "Because part of you needed to hear it." He met her gaze, his jaw tightening. "You speak boldly for a servant." "I speak truthfully," she said, her voice steady. "You've lived in silence too long, Your Grace. It is not peace that keeps you company. It is loneliness." He flinched, just barely. "I had a wife once," he said at last, his voice breaking into the rhythm of confession. "Celeste. She was everything light should be, gentle, laughing, radiant. The first time I saw her she was playing that very piano. I thought her music could save the world." He smiled faintly, but it was a broken smile. "And then I learned how fragile light can be." Eliza's throat tightened. She did not interrupt. "She died because of me," he said. "A carriage accident. She wished to attend a concert, but the storm that night was terrible. I begged her to stay home. She laughed, said that love was worth a little thunder. The wheel broke on the cliff road." He closed his eyes, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I found her myself. She was still holding her sheet music. The room seemed to hold its breath. The fire crackled softly. I forbade music after that, he continued. Every note reminded me of her scream, of what I failed to protect. Eliza's eyes glistened, but her voice remained calm, steady. You did not fail her, Your Grace. Love is not measured by survival. It's measured by how fiercely one remembers. He turned sharply toward her. And you? What do you know of remembrance? Her voice softened. I know what it means to lose everything and still wake each morning hoping the world has room for you. I lost my mother young. I sang her lullaby every night until the day I realized my voice was the only place she still lived. Something shifted in his expression, grief recognizing itself in another soul. For a long while, neither spoke. The storm outside pressed against the windows, wind wailing through the cracks like distant echoes of the past. Finally, the Duke said quietly, When you played that song, I felt something I thought buried with her. Not pain, something gentler, as if the house remembered how to breathe. Eliza's gaze met his. That wasn't her song, Your Grace. It was yours. You simply forgot the tune. He looked at her, and for the first time there was no defense in his eyes, only wonder. Miss Hartwell, he murmured, you speak as though you know my soul. Perhaps, she said softly, I only reminded of what it already knows. The firelight flickered between them, gold and shadow. When she rose to leave, he did not stop her. But as she reached the door, his voice called out again, quiet, uncertain. Would you play again tomorrow? She turned, her heart catching. If you wish it, Your Grace. I do. That night, as she returned to her room, Eliza pressed her hand against her heart. For the first time, she allowed herself to whisper what she dared not name. He's beginning to feel again, and heaven help me, so am I. The next morning dawned pale and golden, the snow outside glimmering like scattered diamonds. The sun's weak warmth filtered through the frosted windows of Ravenshire Hall, touching the old stone walls as if the light itself had chosen to forgive them. In the drawing room, the piano waited, polished, uncovered, alive once more. Eliza Hartwell stood before it, her fingers hovering over the keys as her pulse thrummed with nervous energy. She had not expected the Duke to truly summon her again, but when the footman had delivered the message, His Grace will receive you at 11, her hands had trembled. Now, as the clock struck the hour, the door opened. Sebastian Ravenshire entered with the quiet command of a man accustomed to being obeyed. Yet, for the first time, there was no wall in his expression, only something tentative, almost uncertain. He wore no cravat, his dark waistcoat unbuttoned at the collar, as though he had abandoned formality without quite realizing it. Miss Hartwell, he said, his voice softer than usual. Your Grace. He hesitated by the piano. You play differently than she did. Eliza inclined her head. I play to feel, not to impress. He gave a faint, rueful smile. A dangerous thing, feeling. She looked at him, her voice gentle but firm. More dangerous not to. He said nothing more, but when she sat, he did not stop her. The first notes of her melody drifted into the air, slow, wistful, full of the ache of unspoken things. He closed his eyes, and for a moment he allowed the music to undo him. Each note carried warmth where his heart had once been cold stone. Memories rose. Celeste's laughter, the way his children had once run through these very halls without fear, the nights of silence that had nearly broken him. And beneath all of that, a new memory began to bloom. The sound of Eliza's laughter, the curve of her hand as she guided Clara's reading, the softness in her eyes when she thought he wasn't looking. When the music faded, the silence that followed was no longer sharp. It was sacred. He opened his eyes and met hers. "Do you know," he said quietly, "I haven't spoken to anyone like this in years. Not truly." Eliza's lips curved faintly. "Then perhaps it's time you remembered how." He studied her, his gray eyes catching the light. "You make it sound easy." "It isn't," she admitted, "but it's possible." He exhaled, his voice low. "I have spent so long fearing that if I opened my heart again, it would destroy me. But when you play, I wonder if it might save me instead." The words caught her off guard. She lowered her gaze, her pulse quickening. "Your Grace, But he stepped closer, slowly, as though afraid to startle her. "Tell me, Miss Hartwell," he murmured, "what do you see when you look at this house?" She glanced around, the tall windows, the cold marble, the portraits draped in shadow. "A place that grieves," she said softly, "but also one that's waiting to live again." "And its master?" Her eyes lifted to his. "A man who still believes he doesn't deserve to." For a long, fragile heartbeat, they stood there, the distance between them filled with everything they could not say. The fire crackled softly, throwing gold light across their faces. Then Clara's laughter rang out from the corridor, bright and clear. The moment broke, but it did not vanish. Sebastian's mouth softened into a faint, reluctant smile. "She's laughing again." "She's healing," Eliza said. "You both are." He nodded, his gaze distant but gentle. "You've done more for this house than I thought possible." "It wasn't just me, Your Grace," she said quietly. "It was love in all its hidden places." He looked at her as though seeing her for the first time. "Love," he repeated softly, the word foreign on his tongue. When she turned to leave, his voice stopped her at the door. "Miss Hartwell." "Yes, Your Grace." He hesitated, then said, "Would you teach Clara that song you played?" Eliza's face lit with warmth. "Of course." He nodded, then added almost shyly, "And perhaps teach me some day." Her smile deepened. "It would be my honor." As she left the room, her footsteps light, the Duke stood before the piano once more. He pressed one key, just one, and listened as the sound echoed softly through the hall. And for the first time in years, he did not hear loss. He heard promise. That night, when he passed the children's rooms, he paused outside the door. Clara was singing Eliza's lullaby. Thomas joined in, off-key but joyful. The Duke leaned his forehead against the wall, his eyes closing. His children's voices were no longer ghosts of what he'd lost. They were the proof of what he'd found. And deep within him, a truth began to unfold like spring through frost. Perhaps love was never gone, only waiting for someone brave enough to remind me. As winter melted into the pale green of early spring, Ravenshire Hall seemed reborn. The moors that once slept under frost now shimmered with morning dew, and the air was no longer filled with silence, but with the hum of new beginnings. The servants spoke of it quietly, as if saying it aloud would break the spell. How the Duke had changed. He no longer dined alone. He rode with his children in the mornings. He even smiled. And at the center of this quiet transformation was Eliza Hartwell. To the children, she was both teacher and friend. To the staff, a blessing. But to Sebastian Ravenshire, though he would not yet admit it, she was something far more dangerous. He found himself seeking her company without intention. A question about the children's progress would turn into a conversation about poetry. A brief meeting in the corridor would stretch into an hour of laughter by the fire. He began to remember how it felt to be known. But as all tender things do, their closeness drew eyes and tongues. One afternoon, as Eliza walked through the servants' corridor, she overheard two maids whispering, "They say His Grace spends his evenings in the drawing-room again," one murmured. "With her," said the other, "the governess." Imagine! A duke and a servant! Imagine the scandal if it were true! Eliza stopped mid-step, the words stinging sharper than a frost. She moved past them quietly, pretending not to hear. But their voices clung to her like smoke. That night she could not sleep. She sat by her small window, watching the rain slide down the glass, and whispered, "What am I doing?" Because she knew, she felt, the truth her heart could no longer deny. The Duke's voice, his gaze, his rare smile that seemed to thaw everything around him, they had begun to mean too much. And she was no fool. She was a governess, a woman of no title, no fortune. The world would never permit what her heart dared to imagine. The next morning she resolved to keep her distance. When Sebastian entered the schoolroom to deliver a book he thought Clara might enjoy, she greeted him with polite formality. "Your Grace," she said, curtsying briefly, "the children thank you for the volume." He frowned slightly. "And you, Miss Hartwell?" "I thank you as well." There was something different in her tone, cool, distant. He studied her, his brow furrowing. "You seem changed." She forced a small smile. "Perhaps I've simply learned my place." The words cut him in a way he did not expect. That evening he found himself pacing his study, the fire burning low, his mind restless. The thought of her withdrawing, of the warmth between them fading, unsettled him more than he cared to admit. He poured a glass of brandy, but set it down untouched. When Mrs. Pembroke entered with correspondence, he asked, "What are they saying?" The housekeeper hesitated. "About what, Your Grace?" "About Miss Hartwell." Mrs. Pembroke's silence was answer enough. "Rumors," he said bitterly. "Always rumors." She nodded. "Forgive my honesty, my lord, but the staff, they see what they wish to see. And the world outside would see worse. You are a duke. She is—" "I know what she is," he interrupted sharply, "and I know what she is not. She is not undeserving of respect." Mrs. Pembroke's eyes softened. "No one doubts her worth, Your Grace. Only the world's cruelty." After she left, he stood in silence, staring into the fire. The truth gnawed at him. Society would never accept it, and yet, how could he return to the cold he had known before her? The next day he summoned her to the library. "Miss Hartwell," he began, his voice measured but strained, "it has come to my attention that gossip has reached beyond this household." "Yes, Your Grace," she said quietly. "You understand the damage such talk could do, to you and to my children." "I do." "Then it is best," he continued, though the words nearly strangled him, "that we maintain formality, for their sake." Her throat tightened, but she bowed her head. "As you wish, Your Grace." He wanted to say more, to tell her that it wasn't formality he desired, but protection, that the thought of her being spoken of cruelly filled him with rage. But he said nothing. When she turned to leave, he called out softly, "Miss Hartwell." She paused. He hesitated, then said only, "You've brought light to this house. That is no small thing." She smiled faintly, her voice trembling. "Even light fades, Your Grace, when the world forbids it to shine. After she was gone, the Duke sank into his chair, his hands trembling. For years he had feared the weight of love. Now he feared the cost of it. And somewhere in the corridors above, Clara sang the lullaby Eliza had taught her, the same melody that had once brought him peace. Only now it hurt, because it reminded him of everything he wanted but dared not claim. Outside, the spring wind howled through the trees, carrying the scent of rain and heartbreak. Inside, Ravenshire Hall grew quiet again, but this time it was not grief's silence. It was love denied. It was late April when the storm returned. Not the kind that fell from the heavens, but the kind that broke hearts and shattered peace. Days had passed since the Duke and Eliza last spoke beyond the bare necessities. The lessons continued, the children's laughter lingered, but between them lay a silence colder than any winter. It was the silence of restraint, the cruel kind that exists only when two hearts are too proud to confess what they feel. That evening, dark clouds gathered over Ravenshire Hall, mirroring the unrest within. The wind tore at the trees, rain lashing against the windows like fingers begging to be let in. Eliza stood in the schoolroom, packing away the children's books. Her chest ached with a heaviness she could not shake. She had promised herself she would be strong, that she would not wish for what she could never have. And yet, every glance, every word unsaid between her and the Duke made her resolve tremble. A sudden knock startled her. Mrs. Pembroke entered, worry etched across her face. "Miss Hartwell," she said, "the Duke has ridden out into the storm." Eliza turned sharply. "Alone?" "He left an hour ago, said he needed air, but—" A flash of lightning illuminated the windows. The thunder followed, fierce and immediate. Without thinking, Eliza grabbed her cloak. "He shouldn't be out there." Miss Hartwell. But she was already gone. The courtyard was a tempest of wind and rain. Her skirts clung to her legs, her hair whipped loose, and the path was slick with mud. She could barely see, but she knew where he would go. The cliffs beyond the stables, where the moor met the sea. She found him there, a dark silhouette against the storm. His coat whipped in the wind, his hands clenched at his sides. He stood at the edge, rain streaming down his face like tears he refused to shed. "Your Grace!" she cried, her voice almost lost to the wind. He turned sharply, surprise flashing through his storm-gray eyes. "You shouldn't be here. Neither should you." Lightning split the sky, casting them both in ghostly light. She stumbled closer, her voice trembling with anger and fear. "Why do you do this to yourself? To them? To me?" He stared at her, the words striking harder than the rain. "To you?" "Yes," she shouted, her voice breaking. "Do you think it hurts only you to keep pretending? To walk these halls as if nothing has changed when everything has?" His breath caught. "You don't know what you're saying." "I know exactly what I'm saying," she said, her eyes fierce, glistening with rain and tears. "I tried to do what was right, to stay silent, to remember my place, but every time you walk into a room, I forget how to breathe." He took a step forward, his voice raw. "You think this is easy for me? That I don't wake each morning fighting the same madness? You've made me feel things I swore were dead, and I don't know how to forgive you for that." She blinked, stunned. "Forgive me?" "For making me want to live again," he said, his voice cracking. For a long moment, there was only the sound of the sea crashing below them. The world seemed to hold its breath. Eliza shook her head, her tears mingling with the storm. You call that madness, your grace? I call it mercy." He looked at her then, really looked. The wind tangled her hair, her cloak clung to her shoulders, and yet there was nothing fragile in her. She was the storm itself, alive, unafraid, unyielding. "Eli," he began, then stopped himself, her name half swallowed by the thunder. She stepped closer, voice trembling but sure. "You can deny what this is, but you cannot deny what it's done to you. You're not the man you were when I came here. You're stronger now, kinder. You've let the world back in. That's not weakness, my lord. That's love." He flinched, as though the word itself were a blade. "Love?" he echoed, his tone breaking between disbelief and longing. "You dare speak of love to a man who's lost it once already?" "I dare," she whispered, "because love is not what you lost. It's what you found again, in them, in this house, and in me." Lightning cracked above them, illuminating his face, torn between ruin and revelation. He reached for her as if drawn by something greater than will. His hand brushed her cheek, cold from the rain. For a moment the storm ceased to matter. "Eliza," he breathed, the name finally free from restraint. "If I love you, I destroy you." She met his gaze, steady and fearless. "Then let love destroy me, your grace, so long as I know it was real." The distance between them vanished. The storm howled, the sea roared, and he kissed her, not in passion alone, but in surrender. The years of grief, guilt, and silence broke all at once. When they finally pulled apart, both trembling, he whispered, "You've undone me." "No," she said softly, her hand resting over his heart. "I've only reminded you how to begin again." Behind them, thunder rolled like a closing vow, and as they stood on the cliff's edge, the world did not end. It began anew, with two hearts that had finally stopped hiding. When morning came, Ravenshire Hall stood quiet beneath a sky washed clean of its storm. The moors shimmered under pale sunlight, and the air smelled of rain and rebirth. The storm had passed, but within the Duke's heart something far greater had shifted. Sebastian Ravenshire stood in the garden, his coat still damp from the night before. He looked out across the fields, the earth glistening, the world seemingly new. For the first time in years, the ache in his chest did not feel like grief. It felt like life, heavy, fragile, and real. He heard footsteps behind him. He didn't need to turn to know who they belonged to. "Your Grace," came Eliza's voice, soft but steady. He turned then. She stood by the garden's edge, her cloak draped loosely about her shoulders, her hair half loosened by the wind. Her eyes met his, and in them was neither apology nor fear, only truth. For a long moment they simply looked at one another, as if the world itself had paused to listen. He was the first to speak. "You should not have come to me last night." "I know," she said quietly, "but I would again." His lips curved into the faintest smile. "You risked everything." "So did you," she replied. "Only difference is, I did it for love. You did it to keep from feeling it." The words hit him like sunlight breaking through fog. He took a slow step forward, his voice trembling. "You think me still a coward?" "I think you a man," she said, "one who's finally learned that love doesn't weaken, it saves." He stared at her, and for the first time he laughed, a deep, quiet laugh that startled even him. "You have an unshakable way of being right, Miss Hartwell." "Then perhaps you should start listening, Your Grace." He moved closer now, each step deliberate, until they stood face to face. "And if I did?" If I listened, truly listened, what would you have me do? Her breath trembled. Don't send me away. He reached out, his gloved hand brushing against her cheek. If I keep you, the world will speak. Let it, she whispered. They've spoken before, about you, about me. Let them choke on their own words while we live ours. The conviction in her voice broke through his last defense. He caught her hand, pressing it to his heart. Do you know what you've done, Eliza Hartwell? She smiled faintly. I believe I've taught you your final lesson, Your Grace. He laughed softly, shaking his head. No, you've taught me my first. Their eyes met, no longer a servant and a master, but two souls who had found home in each other's brokenness. Later that morning, when the children ran into the drawing room, they found their father standing by the piano. Eliza sat beside it, smiling softly as Clara climbed into her lap. Play the song, Miss Hartwell, Clara pleaded. Eliza began the melody, the same lullaby that had once haunted the house, now reborn as a hymn of peace. Halfway through, Sebastian joined her, his hand steady on the keys. The sound filled the room, rich and golden. Thomas whispered to the housekeeper, Father's playing again. Mrs. Pembroke wiped her eyes. Aye, she said softly, and so is life. Outside the sun broke fully through the clouds, spilling light through the tall windows. The hall, once a tomb of silence, now pulsed with warmth, laughter, music, love. When the song ended, the Duke turned to Eliza. I've decided something. She looked up, half smiling. That sounds dangerous. I'm done pretending the world decides for me, he said simply. A duke I may be, but I'm still a man, and a man in love has no master but his heart. Her breath caught, her eyes shining. Sebastian! He took her hands in his. Eliza Hartwell, will you make Ravenshire Hall a home again, not as governess, but as duchess? The children gasped. Mrs. Pembroke nearly dropped the tray she carried. Eliza froze, tears spilling down her cheeks. You cannot mean— I do, he said, and I will. The world can whisper, the tongue can scorn. Let them. I've lived long enough with ghosts. I choose life. I choose you. The music still lingered in the air when he kissed her, not desperate this time, but certain. It was the kind of kiss that sealed fates and rewrote history. Outside, the bells of Ravenshire village began to ring faintly, as if the heavens themselves approved, and when the story of the Duke and his governess was told in years to come, people would say that it began with grief but ended with grace, a tale of a man who feared love and a woman who taught him to listen to its song. For even the coldest heart, she had once said, can find its tune again, if only someone dares to play it.